The stagecoach rattled into Old Tucson, Arizona territory, on a blistering afternoon in July of 1882, carrying a young woman whose trembling hands clutched a worn carpetbag as if it contained all her worldly possessions, which it very nearly did. Natalie Durham pressed her nose against the dusty window, watching the sun-bleached buildings of her new home come into view. Her heart hammered against her ribs with equal parts terror and hope. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Russell Jenkins, who had placed an advertisement in the newspaper seeking a wife. Their correspondence had been brief but kind, his letters painted in careful script by what she assumed was his own hand, speaking of a good ranch with cattle and horses, of sunsets that stretched across the desert sky in shades of amber and rose, of a life that could be hard but fulfilling with the right woman beside him. What Russell did not know, what Natalie had carefully concealed through their exchange of letters, was that she could not read a single word he had written. Her oldest sister Margaret had read his letters aloud to her, and Margaret had penned Natalie's responses based on what Natalie dictated. It was a shameful secret, one that burned in her chest like a hot coal. In Philadelphia, she had been a seamstress in a factory, working from dawn until dusk for wages that barely kept her fed. When the factory had closed its doors, she had found herself with few options and even fewer prospects. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like providence, or perhaps desperation disguised as hope. Margaret had encouraged her, insisting that many women could not read, that it was nothing to be ashamed of, that a good man would understand. But Natalie knew better. She had seen the way people looked at those who could not read, as if they were simple or lazy or both. She had kept her secret close, learning to navigate the world through memorization and careful observation, always finding excuses when words were placed before her. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of a wooden building with a sign she could not decipher. Passengers began to disembark, and Natalie took a steadying breath. She smoothed down her best dress, a modest gray traveling suit that had seen better days, and adjusted the small hat perched on her dark brown hair. At 22 years old, she was setting out to build a new life, and the weight of her deception sat heavy on her shoulders. A driver opened the door and offered his hand. Natalie stepped down onto the dusty street, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The heat was different here, dry and unrelenting, nothing like the humid summers of Philadelphia. She scanned the faces of the people moving about the town, wondering which one belonged to Russell Jenkins. "Miss Durham," the voice came from her left, deep and cautious. Natalie turned and found herself looking up at a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore a brown hat that shaded his face, dusty boots, and clothes that spoke of hard work and honest living. His jaw was strong, dusted with stubble that suggested he had risen early and worked through the day. He held his hat in his hands now, his fingers working the brim nervously. "Yes," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Jenkins, Russell," he said quickly, and a smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face into something warm and approachable. "Just Russell, if that is all right with you. Then you must call me Natalie." They stood there for a moment, two strangers who had agreed to bind their lives together, taking measure of each other under the watchful eyes of curious townsfolk. Natalie saw kindness in his face and something else, a loneliness that she recognized because it mirrored her own. "I hope your journey was not too difficult," Russell said, reaching for her carpetbag. "It is a long way from Philadelphia." "It was long," Natalie admitted, "but I am here now and I am grateful for that." Russell's smile widened just a fraction. "I have a wagon just over here." The ranch is about an hour's ride from town. I thought we might stop at the general store first if you need anything, supplies, or whatever you might require." Natalie nodded, following him to a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses. He helped her up onto the seat with a gentleness that surprised her, his hand firm and steady under her elbow. When he climbed up beside her and took the reins, she caught the scent of leather and soap, and something earthy that she could not quite name. They rode through town in a silence that was not quite comfortable but not entirely awkward either. Natalie watched the buildings pass, the saloon with its swinging doors, the sheriff's office, a small church with a white steeple. People went about their business, some pausing to stare at the woman sitting beside Russell Jenkins, no doubt wondering about the mail-order bride who had come all this way. The general store was a welcome respite from the sun. Inside it was cooler, and the air smelled of coffee and dried goods, and something sweet Natalie could not identify. Russell stood back, letting her browse, but Natalie felt panic rising in her throat. Shelves lined with goods, some with labels she could not read, others that she could only identify by their shape or smell. She moved slowly, pretending to examine items while her mind raced. "Can I help you find something, miss?" A woman appeared beside her, older and round-faced with kind eyes. "I am Mrs. Patterson. I run this store with my husband." "I am just looking," Natalie said carefully. "Thank you." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "You must be the young lady Russell has been expecting. He has been like a nervous cat these past few days, making sure everything was perfect at the ranch." Natalie glanced over at Russell, who was speaking with Mr. Patterson near the counter. His ears had turned slightly red, and she felt a flutter of something in her chest. He had been nervous. He had wanted things to be perfect for her. "He seems like a good man," Natalie said softly. "One of the best," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Lost his parents to fever 3 years back. He has been running that ranch alone ever since, working himself near to death. He needs someone, and I am glad he has found you." The words were meant to be comforting, but they only added to the weight Natalie carried. She was supposed to be a help to him, a partner, and yet she carried a secret that could change everything. They left the store with supplies loaded in the back of the wagon, and Russell guided the horses out of town. The landscape opened up before them, vast and beautiful in a way that stole Natalie's breath. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the blue sky, and the desert stretched out in shades of tan and gold and green where hardy plants clung to life. It was so different from the crowded streets and brick buildings of Philadelphia that Natalie felt as if she had stepped onto another world entirely. "It is beautiful," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Russell looked at her, surprise and pleasure evident in his expression. "I am glad you think so. Some people find it too harsh, too empty, but I have always loved it. There is a freedom here, a space to breathe." "I can feel that," Natalie said, and it was true. Despite her fear, despite the uncertainty of her situation, there was something about this land that called to something deep inside her. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was modest but well-maintained, a house of wood and stone with a porch that wrapped around the front, a barn that looked sturdy and freshly painted, corrals where horses grazed in the fading light. Beyond, cattle dotted the landscape, and Natalie could hear the distant sound of a stream. Russell helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together, his hands still at her waist, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. Their eyes met, and Natalie saw uncertainty there that matched her own, but also hope. "Welcome home," he said quietly. The word home lodged in Natalie's throat. She had not had a place that truly felt like home in so long. The boarding house in Philadelphia had been just a place to sleep, The factory just a place to work. But looking at this ranch, at the care Russell had put into it, at the vulnerability in his eyes, she wanted desperately for this to be home. Inside, the house was clean and simply furnished. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room with a worn sofa and 2 chairs arranged before it. A kitchen area occupied one corner, and Natalie could see 2 doors that she assumed led to bedrooms. Everything was neat, almost too neat, as if Russell had spent considerable time preparing for her arrival. "I know it is not fancy," Russell said, setting her carpetbag down carefully. "But it is sturdy and warm in the winter, cool in the summer. The bedroom on the left is yours. I will take the smaller one on the right. I thought you might like some time to settle in to get used to things before we make things official." Natalie looked at him, this man who was offering her time and space when he could have demanded his rights as her husband immediately. Gratitude flooded through her. "Thank you," she said. "That is very kind." Russell ducked his head, his ears reddening again. "I will bring your bag to your room and then start on supper. I am not the best cook, but I can manage a decent stew." He was true to his word. While Natalie unpacked her few belongings in the bedroom that was now hers, Russell worked in the kitchen. She could hear him moving about, the clank of pots, the sound of water being poured. Her room was simple but comfortable, with a bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser with a mirror, a small table with a lamp. On the table sat a stack of books, and Natalie's heart sank. She picked up the top book, running her fingers over the cover, pretending she could decipher the title. The weight of her secret pressed down on her again. Russell was clearly a man who valued learning, who kept books in his home. What would he think when he discovered she could not read them? Supper was a quiet affair, but not unpleasant. Russell's stew was better than he had claimed, hearty and warming. They sat at a small wooden table, and Russell told her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, about his plans for the future. Natalie listened, asking questions when she could, trying to imagine herself as part of this life. After supper, Russell washed the dishes while Natalie dried them, and the domestic rhythm felt strange and new and oddly right. When the last dish was put away, Russell cleared his throat. "I usually read for a bit before bed," he said, gesturing toward the sofa. "I have some books if you would like to join me, or if you are tired from your journey, I understand." Natalie's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She could make an excuse, claim exhaustion, but that would only delay the inevitable. She thought of Margaret's words, that a good man would understand, and she gathered her courage. "Russell," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "there is something I need to tell you." He turned to her, concern crossing his face. "What is it?" Natalie twisted her hands together, unable to meet his eyes. "I have not been entirely honest with you, in our letters, I mean. The truth is, I did not write those letters. My sister did. She wrote them for me because I cannot read or write. I never learned." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Natalie forced herself to look up, to face whatever judgment she would find in his eyes. But Russell was not looking at her with disgust or anger. His brow was furrowed, his expression thoughtful. "You cannot read," he repeated, as if trying to understand. "No," Natalie whispered. "I am sorry. I should have told you before, but I was afraid you would not want me if you knew. I understand if you are angry, if you want to send me back." Russell set down the dish towel he was still holding and took a step closer to her. "Natalie, look at me." She did, expecting to see disappointment, but instead seeing something that looked almost like tenderness. "I am not angry," he said firmly, "and I certainly do not want to send you back. Many people cannot read. It is nothing to be ashamed of. But you can," Natalie said, gesturing toward the books on the shelf. "You value learning. I saw the books you left in my room. I am not what you expected. Russell was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Then he reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle. "Natalie, I did not send for a mail-order bride because I wanted someone educated or refined. I sent for a bride because I was lonely, because I wanted a partner, someone to build a life with." The words in those letters, they were yours, were they not? Even if your sister wrote them down, they were your thoughts, your feelings. "Yes," Natalie breathed. "Then that is what matters." Russell squeezed her hand gently. "And if you cannot read, then I will read to you every night. If you want to learn, I can teach you. But even if you do not want to learn, it changes nothing about why you are here." Tears sprang to Natalie's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. No one had ever been so kind about her failing, so understanding. Margaret had been supportive, but even she had looked at Natalie with pity sometimes. Russell was looking at her as if she was simply a person, not a deficiency to be corrected. "You would do that?" she asked. "Read to me." "Every night," Russell promised. "Starting tonight if you would like." And so they settled on the sofa together, a careful distance between them, and Russell opened a book. His voice was steady and warm as he began to read, and Natalie found herself getting lost in the story. It was an adventure tale about a man traveling through unexplored territories, facing dangers and finding unexpected allies. Russell read with expression, changing his voice slightly for different characters, and Natalie found herself laughing at some parts, holding her breath at others. When he finally closed the book, Natalie realized that hours had passed, that the lamp was burning low and the night had grown deep around them. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was wonderful." Russell smiled, and in the lamplight he looked younger, less weathered. "I am glad you enjoyed it. We can read more tomorrow night if you would like." "I would like that very much." They said good night and retreated to their separate rooms, but Natalie lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the man in the other room. She had come to Arizona expecting duty and obligation, perhaps tolerance at best. She had not expected kindness, had not expected someone who would look at her secret and respond with understanding rather than judgment. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Natalie with its ease. She woke early with Russell, made breakfast while he tended to the animals, and then set about learning the routines of ranch life. There was always work to be done, cleaning and mending, tending to the vegetable garden behind the house, preparing meals. Russell worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing fences, moving cattle, training horses. He hired 2 ranch hands who came during the day, men named Tom and Billy who were polite and respectful and clearly curious about the new Mrs. Jenkins, though Russell had not yet made their marriage official. Every evening, after supper was finished and the dishes were washed, Russell and Natalie would sit together on the sofa, and he would read to her. Sometimes it was adventure stories, sometimes tales of romance that made Natalie's heart flutter, sometimes accounts of history or explorations. Russell never made her feel foolish for not being able to read the words herself. Instead, he brought the stories to life with his voice, and Natalie found herself looking forward to those evenings more than anything else. As the weeks passed, the careful distance between them began to close. They sat closer on the sofa, their shoulders touching. Russell's hand would sometimes find hers during particularly exciting parts of the story. They talked more, sharing pieces of their pasts. Russell told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents and how much he missed them, about the loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement. Natalie told him about Philadelphia, about working in the factory, about her sisters and the poverty that had shaped her childhood, about never having the opportunity to attend school because she had been needed to work. One evening, about a month after Natalie's arrival, Russell set down the book they had been reading and turned to face her fully. "Natalie," he said, his voice serious, "we have been living as roommates, as friends, but I would like for us to be truly married if that is something you want as well. I do not want to rush you, but I find that I care for you more than I expected to care for someone I barely knew." Natalie's heart raced. She had been feeling the same way, this growing affection that blossomed every time Russell was kind, every time he made her laugh, every time his voice washed over her during their evening readings. "I care for you too," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And I would like for us to be truly married." Russell's face broke into a smile that transformed him, and he leaned forward, cupping her face gently in his work-roughened hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Natalie whispered. His kiss was soft and tentative, a question and a promise all at once. Natalie leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. When they pulled apart, both were breathing a little faster, both were smiling. "We should go to town tomorrow," Russell said. "See the preacher and make this official." "I would like that." They were married the next day in a simple ceremony at the small church in Old Tucson. Mrs. Patterson and her husband stood as witnesses, and the preacher spoke words that Natalie felt in her soul even if she could not read them from the Bible he held. When Russell slipped a simple gold band on her finger, Natalie felt tears slip down her cheeks, and Russell gently wiped them away with his thumb. That night, they came together as husband and wife in truth, and Natalie discovered that the tenderness Russell showed in all things extended to this as well. He was patient and gentle, and when she cried out his name, it was with joy and a sense of belonging she had never known before. Their life together deepened as summer turned to fall. The days grew slightly cooler, though the Arizona sun still beat down with considerable heat. Natalie learned more about running the ranch, about the cattle and the horses, about the land and its rhythms. Russell taught her to ride, his hands steady on her waist as he helped her mount, his voice encouraging as she learned to guide the horse. One evening in late September, as they sat together after supper, Russell pulled out not a storybook but a primer, the kind used to teach children their letters. "I thought," he said carefully, "that if you were interested, we could work on reading together. Not because you need to learn, but because you mentioned once that you wished you could read the stories yourself." Natalie looked at the book, then at Russell. She had mentioned it only in passing, a wistful comment that she had not expected him to remember, but of course he had remembered. Russell paid attention to everything she said, every small wish she expressed. "I would like that," she said, "but I must warn you I am not a quick learner. My sister tried to teach me when I was young, but I struggled." "Then we will take it slow," Russell said. "There is no rush, we have all the time in the world." And so they added a new element to their evening routine. First, Russell would help Natalie with her letters, starting with the alphabet, teaching her to recognize each shape and the sound it made. Then they would read together, Russell's finger following the words as he read them aloud, helping Natalie to connect the sounds she was learning to the words on the page. It was frustrating at times, and Natalie often felt discouraged, but Russell never lost patience. He celebrated every small victory, every letter she learned, every simple word she managed to sound out on her own. As fall deepened, Natalie began to feel unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but when the nausea persisted for over a week, Mrs. Patterson, who had become a friend through their occasional trips to town, pulled her aside. "Natalie, dear," she said gently, "have you considered that you might be with child?" The thought had not occurred to Natalie, but as soon as Mrs. Patterson said it, she knew it was true. She counted back the weeks since her wedding night and realized that her monthly courses had not come. When she told Russell that evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His eyes widened, then filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Natalie asked, though she could already see that he was. "Happy does not begin to describe it," Russell said, pulling back to look at her. "I am overjoyed. I am terrified. I am grateful. Natalie, you have given me so much already, and now this." They held each other for a long time, and that night, Russell read to her from a book about parenting that he had purchased months ago, hoping but not daring to expect. Natalie listened, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, imagining the child growing within her. Winter came to Arizona, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. Natalie's pregnancy progressed, and Russell was attentive to the point of being overprotective. He insisted she rest more, took over tasks he thought might be too strenuous, and worried constantly about her well-being. Natalie found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, but she could not fault him for caring so much. Their evening routine continued, with Russell helping her with her reading and then reading aloud to her. By Christmas, Natalie could read simple sentences on her own, and she surprised Russell on Christmas morning with a letter she had painstakingly written herself. It was short and the spelling was imperfect, but it was hers, and when Russell read it, tears streaming down his face, she knew that it was the best gift she could have given him. The letter read, "Dear Russell, thank you for being so kind. Thank you for reading to me. Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for loving me. I love you too. Your wife, Natalie." Russell kept that letter folded in his pocket, and Natalie would sometimes see him take it out during the day, reading it again as if to remind himself that it was real. Spring arrived with wildflowers blooming across the desert, and Natalie's belly grew round with their child. She moved more slowly now, and Russell made her promise not to do any heavy work. Mrs. Patterson visited regularly, checking on Natalie and offering advice about the coming birth. One evening in late April, as they sat together on the sofa, Natalie felt the first pain grip her belly. She gasped, her hand going to her stomach, and Russell was on his feet immediately. "Is it time?" he asked, his face pale. "I think so," Natalie said, breathing through the contraction. Russell rode to town at breakneck speed to fetch the midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Chen, who had helped bring most of the babies in Old Tucson into the world. She arrived calm and competent, shooing Russell out of the bedroom and setting about helping Natalie through her labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Natalie thought she could not endure another minute. But Mrs. Chen was steady and encouraging, and Natalie focused on the thought of holding her baby, of seeing Russell's face when he met his child. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally came, a lusty cry filling the room. Mrs. Chen worked quickly, cleaning the baby and wrapping it in a soft blanket before placing the tiny bundle in Natalie's arms. "You have a son," Mrs. Chen said with a smile. "A healthy, strong boy." Natalie looked down at the red, wrinkled face of her son and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. He had Russell's chin and a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes briefly, they were the same creek watercolor as his father's. "Can you bring Russell in?" Natalie asked, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. Mrs. Chen opened the door and Russell practically fell into the room. He looked exhausted and terrified, but when he saw Natalie holding their son, his expression transformed into pure wonder. "Come meet your son," Natalie said softly. Russell approached slowly, as if afraid he might break something, and sank down onto the edge of the bed. He looked at the baby with awe, reaching out one finger to gently touch the tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around Russell's much larger one, and Russell let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is perfect," Russell said. "You are perfect. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for this gift." They named him Robert James Jenkins, and he was indeed perfect, at least in his parents' eyes. He was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. Russell was a devoted father, taking turns walking with Robert when he fussed at night, changing his diapers without complaint, simply sitting and staring at him for long stretches as if he could not quite believe he was real. The first few months were exhausting but joyful. Natalie was too tired most evenings for reading lessons, but Russell still read aloud, now with Robert sleeping in a cradle beside the sofa. He read children's stories now, along with their usual fare, practicing for when Robert would be old enough to understand. As Robert grew and became more independent, able to entertain himself for short periods, Natalie returned to her reading lessons with renewed determination. She wanted to be able to read to her son, to help him learn his letters when the time came. Russell supported her fully, praising her progress and helping her through difficult passages. One evening, when Robert was about 6 months old and sleeping soundly in his cradle, Natalie picked up one of the books Russell usually read from. She opened it to the first page and began to read aloud, slowly and carefully, sounding out words she did not immediately recognize. Russell sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, not interrupting or correcting, just listening. When she finished the first page and looked up at him, tears were streaming down his face. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Natalie, you read that whole page yourself." "I did," she said, hardly able to believe it. "I really did." Russell pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I am so proud of you. I have always been proud of you, but watching you work so hard, seeing you achieve this, it is incredible." "I could not have done it without you," Natalie said. "Without your patience, your teaching, your belief that I could learn." "You had it in you all along," Russell insisted. "I just helped you find it." They held each other, the book forgotten for the moment, and Natalie marveled at how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman on a stagecoach, terrified of her secret being discovered. Now she was a wife and mother, learning to read, building a life with a man who loved her not despite her failings, but with complete acceptance of who she was. The years that followed were full and rich. Natalie's reading improved steadily until she could read nearly as fluently as Russell, though she still loved their evenings when he read aloud to her. It had become their tradition, a way of connecting at the end of each day, and neither wanted to give it up. Robert grew into a bright, active boy with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. When he was 3, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she recognized the signs immediately. Their daughter, Rose, was born on a cool November morning, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Robert was energetic and bold, Rose was thoughtful and gentle. She had Natalie's dark hair and Russell's smile, and she completed their family in a way none of them had known they needed. Natalie taught both children to read, starting with the same primer Russell had used with her. She knew the value of literacy now, knew how it opened up the world, and she was determined that her children would never feel the shame and limitation she had felt. Russell was there for every lesson, supporting and encouraging, and sometimes catching Natalie's eye over the children's heads with a look of such love that it took her breath away. The ranch prospered under Russell's careful management. He hired more hands as the herds grew, and he became known in Old Tucson as a fair and honest rancher. Natalie became involved in the community, helping Mrs. Patterson at the general store sometimes, attending church services, and hosting gatherings at the ranch. She made friends among the other ranch wives, women who valued her practical skills and kind heart. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Russell gave Natalie a gift wrapped in brown paper. She opened it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. "I thought you might like to write your own stories now," Russell said, watching her face. "You have come so far, Natalie. I am in awe of you." Natalie ran her hand over the smooth leather, emotion clogging her throat. "Thank you," she managed. "This is wonderful." That night, after the children were asleep, Natalie opened the journal and began to write. She wrote about her journey from Philadelphia, about her fear and hope. She wrote about meeting Russell for the first time, about confessing her secret, about his response that had changed everything. She wrote about learning to read, about their children, about the life they had built together. Her handwriting was not perfect, and she had to look up spelling sometimes, but the words were hers, flowing from her heart onto the page. Russell read over her shoulder, and when she finished the first entry, he kissed her temple. "Beautiful," he said, "both the words and the woman who wrote them." More years passed, bringing changes and challenges, but also deep joys. Robert grew tall and strong, helping his father with the ranch work. Rose developed a love of reading that rivaled even Russell's, and she could often be found curled up with a book, lost in distant worlds. Natalie continued to write in her journal, documenting their lives, and she also began reading to the children at church on Sunday mornings, a role she took seriously and loved deeply. One summer evening, when Robert was 10 and Rose was 7, the family sat together on the porch as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Russell had his arm around Natalie, and the children were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the gathering dusk. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if you had not come here?" Russell asked quietly. Natalie considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think about the factory, the boarding house, the feeling of being trapped with no future. But it seems like a different lifetime now, like it happened to someone else." "I am grateful every day that you took that chance," Russell said. "That you got on that stagecoach despite your fear. You changed my life, Natalie. You made it full and rich and worth living." "You did the same for me," Natalie said, turning to look at him. The years had added lines to his face, silver to his hair, but his eyes were still the same creek watercolor, still looked at her with the same love and acceptance they had shown on that first night when she confessed her secret. "You saw me, really saw me, and you did not turn away. You gave me everything I never knew I needed." They kissed as the sunset faded and the stars began to emerge, and in the yard, their children's laughter continued. Natalie thought about the moment on the stagecoach when she had clutched her carpet bag and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. She thought about all the fear and shame she had carried. She thought about Russell's words that first night, "Then I will read to you every night." He had kept that promise, and in keeping it, he had given her so much more. He had given her safety and love and a home. He had given her the patience and encouragement to learn something she thought was beyond her reach. He had given her children and a future, and a life that was richer than any story in any book. As the darkness deepened, and the children finally tired of chasing fireflies, the family moved inside. Russell built a fire in the fireplace, even though the summer evening was warm, because it was cozy and comforting. The children settled on the rug with pillows, and Russell and Natalie took their familiar places on the sofa. Russell picked up the book they were currently reading, a new adventure tale that had Robert on the edge of his seat with excitement. But before he opened it, he looked at Natalie with a smile. "Would you like to read tonight?" he asked. Natalie smiled back. "How about we take turns? You read a chapter, then I will read a chapter." "I like that idea," Russell said, and so Russell began to read, his voice filling the room, bringing the story to life. The children listened with rapt attention, and Natalie leaned against her husband's shoulder, feeling the rumble of his voice through his chest. When he finished the chapter, he handed the book to Natalie, and she continued the story, her voice clear and confident. The fire crackled, the children gasped at exciting parts and laughed at funny ones, and Russell's hand found Natalie's, their fingers intertwining. This was their life, built on a foundation of honesty and acceptance, of patience and love. This was the life that had started with a shameful secret and a kind response, with a promise to read together every night. When the children finally grew too sleepy to keep their eyes open, Russell and Natalie tucked them into their beds, kissing their foreheads and whispering words of love. Then they retired to their own room, the one they had shared for years now, and held each other in the darkness. "I love you," Natalie whispered, "more than all the words in all the books." "I love you too," Russell replied. "More than I could ever express, even if I read to you every night for the rest of our lives." "Is that a promise?" Natalie asked, a smile in her voice. "It is a promise," Russell confirmed. "Every night for the rest of our lives," and he kept that promise. Through the years that followed, as their children grew and eventually married and had children of their own, as the ranch continued to thrive, as their hair turned gray and their steps slowed, Russell and Natalie continued their tradition. Every night they would sit together and read, sometimes taking turns, sometimes with Russell reading while Natalie mended or knitted, but always together. When their first grandchild was born, a little girl named Margaret after Natalie's sister, Natalie held her and whispered stories, and Russell read aloud from a children's book, starting the tradition anew with the next generation. Robert's wife, Sarah, would watch with soft eyes, and Rose's husband Thomas would smile, both of them seeing the love that had sustained this family through decades. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch. Robert and Sarah came with their 3 children, and Rose and Thomas brought their 2. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and after a dinner that took hours to prepare and mere minutes to devour, everyone settled in the main room. "Tell us the story," young Margaret begged, climbing into Natalie's lap. "Tell us how you and grandfather met." Natalie looked at Russell, who smiled and nodded. So Natalie told the story as she had told it many times before. She told about coming to Old Tucson on a stagecoach, about meeting Russell for the first time, about her fear of her secret. She told about Russell's response, about his promise to read to her every night, and the children listened with wide eyes as if they were hearing it for the first time. "And did he keep his promise?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Every single night," Natalie confirmed. "Even when I learned to read myself, your grandfather still reads to me." "Because some traditions are too good to give up," Russell added, reaching over to squeeze Natalie's hand. As the evening wore on and the grandchildren were put to bed in various rooms throughout the house, the adults sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. Robert raised a glass in a toast. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us what love really means, who showed us that accepting someone fully, flaws and all, is the foundation of a lasting marriage. Thank you for the example you set, for the love you showed not just to each other but to all of us." Everyone drank to the toast, and Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. She had never imagined on that terrifying day when she stepped off the stagecoach that her life would become this, that her desperate gamble would pay off in ways she could never have dreamed, that a shameful secret would be met with such grace, such kindness, such steadfast love. The years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable challenges that come with growing old. Russell's joints ached on cold mornings and Natalie's eyesight weakened, requiring spectacles for reading. But they faced each challenge together, supporting each other, caring for each other. The ranch was largely run by Robert now, with Russell serving as advisor and occasional help when he felt up to it. Natalie spent her days with her grandchildren when they visited, teaching them to read and write, telling them stories, passing on the lessons she had learned. One winter evening, when Natalie was 60 and Russell 63, they sat before the fire in their usual spots. The house was quiet, with no children or grandchildren visiting that night. Russell reached for their current book, but Natalie stopped him. "Can we read from this instead?" she asked, pulling out her old journal, the leather worn soft from years of handling. Russell smiled. "I would love that." Natalie opened to the first entry, the one she had written over 30 years ago, and began to read. Her voice was older now, but no less strong, and as she read about her journey, about her fears, about meeting Russell and confessing her secret, she was transported back to those early days. When she reached the part about Russell's response, his promise to read to her every night, Russell's hand tightened on hers. "Best decision I ever made," he said softly. "Best decision we both made," Natalie corrected. "You to accept me, me to trust you with the truth." They continued reading through the journal, reliving their life together through Natalie's words. The birth of their children, the growth of the ranch, the small moments and large ones that had made up their years. When Natalie's voice grew tired, Russell took over, reading her own words back to her. It was late when they finally closed the journal. The fire burned down to embers. "I am grateful," Natalie said, leaning her head on Russell's shoulder, "for all of it, for you most of all." "And I am grateful for you," Russell replied. "For your courage in coming here, for your honesty even when it frightened you, for every day you have given me since." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the embers glow. Then Russell stirred, picking up the book they had been reading. "One more chapter before bed?" he asked with a smile. Natalie laughed. "Always." And so Russell read, his voice washing over her as it had for decades, bringing a story to life in the quiet of their home. Natalie closed her eyes, not from tiredness but from contentment, listening to the voice she loved more than any other, grateful beyond measure for the man who had met her secret with acceptance and her fear with love. When the chapter ended, they made their way to bed, moving slowly but together. They lay in the darkness, Russell's arm around Natalie, her head on his chest, and Natalie thought about all the nights they had spent this way, all the stories they had shared, all the love they had built. "Russell," she said softly. "Yes, my love, thank you for reading to me, for teaching me, for loving me." "It has been my greatest privilege," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every word, every page, every night. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Natalie tilted her face up, and even in the darkness she could feel Russell's gaze on her. They kissed, a gentle, familiar kiss that held decades of love and intimacy and partnership. When they settled back down, Natalie felt sleep beginning to claim her. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Russell replied. "Always have, always will." More years passed, and they eventually became great-grandparents, delighting in the arrival of each new generation. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through Robert and eventually to his children. The house was filled with life and love, with children's laughter and the smell of cooking and the sound of stories being read aloud. Russell and Natalie grew frail, their bodies wearing down, but their love remained as strong as ever. They moved more slowly, needed more rest, but every evening they still sat together and read. Sometimes Russell read to Natalie, sometimes Natalie read to Russell, sometimes they simply sat in silence, holding hands, the comfort of each other's presence enough. On a spring morning, when the desert was blooming with wildflowers and the air was sweet with the promise of new life. Russell woke to find Natalie still sleeping beside him. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed, and for a moment he simply watched her, this woman who had changed his life in every way. Then he realized she was too still, her chest not rising with breath, and he understood with a grief that threatened to split him open that she was gone. The family gathered, mourning the loss of the woman who had been the heart of their home. They buried Natalie on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the land she had loved, under the vast Arizona sky. Russell stood at her graveside, his children supporting him on either side, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She was the best of us," he said, his voice breaking. "The bravest, the kindest, the strongest. I am grateful for every day I had with her." In the days that followed, Russell struggled. The house felt empty without Natalie's presence, without her laughter, without their evening readings. He still picked up a book each night, sitting in his usual spot on the sofa, but his voice faltered without her there to share the story. One evening, a few weeks after Natalie's passing, little Margaret found him there, tears running down his face, a closed book in his lap. "Grandfather," she said softly, climbing up beside him. "Why are you crying?" "I miss your grandmother," Russell said, not hiding his grief from the child. "I miss reading with her." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then she picked up the book. "Will you read to me, like you used to read to grandmother?" Russell looked at the child, seeing Natalie's eyes looking back at him, and he felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. "I would like that very much." And so he read to Margaret, and in reading, he found a small measure of comfort. The tradition continued, passed down once more. Russell read to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories and love, keeping alive the practice that had defined his marriage. Russell lived for 3 more years after Natalie's passing, and while he grieved her every day, he also celebrated the life they had built together. He told stories about her to anyone who would listen, making sure her bravery and strength were remembered. He kept her journal on his bedside table, reading entries when he missed her most, finding comfort in her words. On a cool autumn evening, surrounded by his family, Russell passed peacefully in his sleep. They buried him beside Natalie on the hill, reuniting them under the vast sky they had both loved. On the headstone, Robert had inscribed, "Russell Jenkins' beloved husband, father, grandfather." He kept his promise. The family continued to gather at the ranch for holidays and special occasions, and the tradition of reading aloud every evening was passed down through the generations. The story of how Russell and Natalie had met, of her confession, and his acceptance of his promise to read to her every night, became a treasured family legend, told and retold to each new generation. Natalie's journal was carefully preserved and eventually given to Margaret when she was old enough to appreciate it. She read through it with tears and laughter, learning about her grandparents' early days, their struggles and triumphs. And one evening, she sat down with her own children and began to read it aloud, sharing the love story that had started with a desperate hope and a kind promise. The ranch thrived for generations, a testament to the foundation Russell and Natalie had built. And in every generation, in every family descended from theirs, the tradition of reading together continued, a living memorial to a love that had transformed 2 lonely people into a family, into a legacy. The books Russell and Natalie had read together were passed down too, carefully preserved, their pages worn from years of use. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the sage and the stars blazed overhead, it seemed as if you could still hear Russell's voice reading aloud, still feel Natalie's presence listening, their love echoing through time, eternal and unbreakable. Their story was one of acceptance and grace, of a secret met with understanding, of a promise kept through decades. It was a reminder that true love sees beyond surface flaws to the person beneath, that patience and kindness can transform lives, that the simple act of reading together each night can build a bond that survives even death. And in Old Tucson, now a much larger town than it had been in 1882, there were still people who remembered the Jenkins Ranch, who told stories about Russell and Natalie, about the mail-order bride who could not read and the cowboy who promised to read to her every night. Their love story became part of the town's history, a tale of the Old West that was gentler than most, but no less powerful for its gentleness. Years turned into decades, and decades into a century, and still the story persisted, passed down through generations, inspiring others with its message of acceptance and love. And somewhere, perhaps in whatever lies beyond this world, Russell and Natalie sat together still, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him while he read aloud in his steady, warm voice, and she listened with a smile, their love story continuing forever in the way all the best love stories do.